While camping in present-day Orange County in 1769, the Portola expedition supposedly encountered a fierce windstorm which they named Los Gustos de Santanas, or Satan's Winds. Later, Spanish settlers mistook this name to mean Santa Ana, which they applied to the valley and river where the winds were the strongest, believing it referred to St. Anne's Day that occurs on July 26th. In the pantheon of Spanish conquistadors or conquerors, the name Juan Rodríguez Cabriio is often linked to his famous exploration of California's coast in the early 1540s. Yet Cabrillo's legacy begins not in the cool coastal breezes of the Pacific, but amidst the heat and tumult of the conquest of Guatemala in Central America. Cabrillo explored the California coast in 1542 to 1543. Cabrillo, one of the first Europeans to explore the California coast, documented seeing large smoke columns rising from the shore as his ships sailed along the coastline. Before he became the first European to set eyes on what is now San Diego Bay, Cabrillo was a soldier and shipbuilder deeply involved in one of the most grueling and pivotal campaigns of the Spanish conquest in the Americas, the subjugation of the Maya in Guatemala. Little is known about Cabrillo's early life, though scholars agree he was likely born around 1499 in either Spain or Portugal. This ambiguity persists because Cabrillo, like many conquistadors of his time, lived in the shadow of greater figures such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. However, what is clear is that Cabrillo's talents and ambition were apparent early on, and he was drawn to the New World, where opportunities for glory and fortune beckoned. By the 1520s, Cabrillo had arrived in the Americas, participating in the conquest of Mexico under Cortés. But it was in Guatemala that he would make his mark, distinguishing himself as both a ruthless soldier and a key figure in the consolidation of Spanish power in Central America. The conquest of Guatemala, which unfolded between 1524 and 1540, was one of the most arduous and bloody campaigns undertaken by the Spanish in the Americas. Unlike the swift overthrow of the Aztec Empire, the Guatemalan conquest was a prolonged and bloody struggle against fiercely resistant indigenous groups, including the Quiché, Caciquel, and Maya peoples. These groups lived in mountainous, jungle-covered terrain that made Spanish advances slow and perilous. Cabrillo joined Pedro de Alvarado, a ruthless lieutenant of Cortés, in this effort. Alvarado, known for his fiery temper and brutal tactics, earned the nickname Tonatiuh, or sun god, from the indigenous people due to his light hair and reputation for relentless aggression. Alvarado married Luz Jiménez, the daughter of Xicotencatl the Elder, a Tlaxcalan noblewoman. Alvarado forged alliances with many indigenous peoples during his campaigns, including in Guatemala. Cabrillo played a pivotal role in both combat and the logistical challenges of the conquest. His skill in organizing men and managing resources earned him Alvarado's trust, and he was often placed in charge of critical tasks, including fortifications and supply lines. Pedro de Alvarado began his campaign in Guatemala in 1523, departing from Mexico with a force of approximately 400 Spaniards and thousands of indigenous allies, primarily Tlaxcalans and Mexica warriors. The expedition crossed into Guatemala primarily by land, though some records suggest that ships were used to transport supplies and reinforcements along the Pacific coast. This maritime element ensured logistical support and coastal control for the Spanish forces. The Spanish relied heavily on horses, dogs, cannons, and steel swords, which gave them a technological edge over the indigenous warriors. The Spanish conquistadors used war dogs for military purposes during their conquests in the Americas. These dogs, trained for combat, played a significant role in the campaigns of the 15th and 16th centuries, instilling fear among indigenous populations and serving as effective weapons of intimidation and physical force. War dogs employed by the conquistadors were typically large breeds, including mastiffs and greyhounds. These dogs were heavily armored with spiked collars and metal plates, further enhancing their fearsome appearance and effectiveness in battle. The Spanish trained their dogs for combat, teaching them to attack on command and target specific enemies. War dogs were used in ambushes and as shock troops to intimidate and control the indigenous population. They were trained to bite, maul, and even kill. Indigenous peoples who had never seen dogs of this size and ferocity were terrified of them. The Spanish weaponized this fear, using the dogs, horses, and steel weapons to break enemy morale and assert dominance. Some accounts describe dogs being unleashed to hunt down fleeing enemies, reinforcing the conquistadors' image as invincible invaders. The horsemen were equipped with lances, crossbows, and swords. The soldiers wore armor and metal helmets for protection, and besides their steel swords, some of them also carried primitive arms known as arquebuses. War horses were armored and trained to intimidate and harass their opponents. Nevertheless, the Mayas' familiarity with the terrain and their guerrilla-style tactics often outmaneuvered the Spanish forces. One of the earliest and most important battles occurred near Quetzaltenango, in the western highlands of Guatemala. Here, Alvarado's forces engaged the Quiche Maya, one of the most powerful Maya kingdoms in the region. The Quiche warriors fought valiantly, led by their king Tecun. According to Maya legend, Tecun personally confronted Alvarado in battle but was killed. This defeat marked a turning point, as the loss of Tecun and his army greatly weakened Quiche resistance. Tecun is now considered a national hero in Guatemala, symbolizing the resilience of the Maya people. Following the victory at Quetzaltenango, Alvarado moved to the Quiche capital of Utatlan, modern-day Santa Cruz del Quiche. The Quiche leaders, recognizing their weakened position, surrendered to the Spanish. However, Alvarado, fearing betrayal, invited the Quiche nobility to a feast under the pretense of peace. Once they arrived, he executed many of them and burned the city. The destruction of Utatlan marked the collapse of Quiche political and military power in the region. After subduing the Quiche, Alvarado turned his attention to the Cacique Maya, another powerful group based at Iximcha, near modern-day Tecpan. Initially, the Cacique allied with the Spanish, hoping to eliminate their rivals, the Quiche. However, relations soured when the Spanish began demanding heavy tributes and enslaving the local population. This led to a Cacique rebellion, which Alvarado violently suppressed. By 1526, the Spanish had defeated the Cacique and captured their capital. One of the most prolonged and dramatic conflicts occurred at Zacualeu, the fortified capital of the Mam Maya. The Mam were led by their ruler, Caibil Balam, who mounted a strong resistance against the Spanish. Gonzalo de Alvarado, Pedro's brother, led the Spanish forces in a siege of the city. The Mam Maya defenders held out for months, but were ultimately forced to surrender due to starvation. The fall of Zacualeu marked the end of organized resistance in the western highlands. Although most of Guatemala was conquered by the mid-1520s, the Itza Maya of the Payton region in northern Guatemala remained independent for much longer. The Spanish made repeated attempts to subdue them, but it was not until 1697 that Martin de Ursua led a successful expedition against the Itza capital of Tayasal on Lake Payton Itza. This marked the final conquest of Guatemala and the incorporation of the last independent Maya kingdom into the Spanish Empire. The Spanish conquest of Guatemala relied heavily on alliances with indigenous groups, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who provided critical manpower and knowledge of local terrain and warfare. Alvarado and his forces used a strategy of divide and conquer, exploiting rivalries between Maya groups, such as the long-standing enmity between the Quiche and Cacique. The Spanish also employed brutal tactics, including the execution of leaders, enslavement, and the destruction of cities, to intimidate and subdue their enemies. Although most of the conquest in Guatemala occurred overland, ships played a supporting role in the Spanish campaign. They were used to transport supplies, reinforcements, and resources along the coast, ensuring that Alvarado's forces maintained logistical support throughout the campaign. Coastal control also helped prevent the Maya from fleeing or receiving outside support. The Spanish conquest of Guatemala dismantled the political and economic structures of the Maya kingdoms, incorporating the region into the Spanish colonial system. Christian missionaries accompanied the conquistadors, leading to the widespread conversion of indigenous peoples to Christianity, often through coercion. The conquest also resulted in a dramatic decline in the indigenous population due to European diseases, forced labor, and warfare. Cabrillo became a trusted ally of Alvarado, aiding him in military campaigns and later in the establishment of settlements. Cabrillo's contributions to the conquest went beyond the battlefield. One of Cabrillo's most notable achievements during this period was his work in what is now Antigua Guatemala. As a skilled shipbuilder, he helped establish key colonial structures that served as the backbone of Spanish administration in the region. His efforts earned him land grants and wealth. By the late 1530s, Cabrillo's focus shifted from land-based conquest to maritime exploration. His experience in Guatemala had established him as a man of action and resourcefulness, qualities that made him a natural candidate for the ambitious naval expeditions Spain was planning along the Pacific coast. These expeditions aimed to locate new trade routes, claim uncharted territories, and find mythical riches, including the fabled Strait of Anian, a supposed passage connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. In 1540, Cabrillo relocated to Mexico, where he became involved in shipbuilding for the Spanish crown. This phase of his career showcased another of his talents: the ability to organize and execute large-scale projects. Cabrillo's ships were robust, well-crafted vessels that would later prove invaluable in the treacherous waters of the Pacific. In 1542, Cabrillo was chosen to lead an expedition to explore the coastline north of what the Spanish called New Spain. Commanding the ships San Salvador, Victoria, and San Miguel, Cabrillo set sail from Navidad, modern-day Jalisco, Mexico, in June of that year. The expedition marked the culmination of his career, combining his skills as a soldier, builder, and navigator. The San Salvador was the flagship, a galleon Cabrillo himself commanded. La Victoria was a smaller ship for support, and the San Miguel was a small vessel used for shallow coastal exploration. The fleet carried provisions, a crew of sailors, soldiers, indigenous laborers, horses, dogs, and livestock for potential colonization efforts. Cabrillo's fleet followed the coastline of Baja California, stopping at several points to resupply, assess the terrain, and interact with indigenous groups. The crew encountered arid and challenging conditions, but were able to replenish water supplies and food. After 4 months at sea, Cabrillo and his crew reached what is now San Diego Bay on September 28, 1542. He named the harbor San Miguel and continued northward, mapping the coast and interacting with indigenous peoples. Cabrillo's detailed observations provided valuable information about the region, including descriptions of the Channel Islands and Monterey Bay. Cabrillo noted the bay's calm waters and the hospitable climate, making it a promising site for potential settlement. He also interacted with the local Kumeyaay people, describing them as friendly and curious. As noted, he also reported seeing large smoke columns rising from the shoreline. Yet, Cabrillo's journey ended in early 1543. While exploring the Channel Islands, he suffered a severe injury, possibly from a fall while disembarking on rocky terrain. The broken leg became infected, and Cabrillo died on January 3, 1543. He was buried on one of the islands, likely San Miguel Island, though the exact location remains a mystery. Early Spanish conquistadors often noted the presence of smoke rising from the Southern California coast, which they initially found mysterious. This smoke was not from wildfires alone, but often resulted from the controlled burns set by indigenous peoples, particularly the Chumash and other tribes inhabiting the region. These early observations provide valuable historical insights into the long-standing relationship between fire and the California landscape. Early Spanish records often describe the land as appearing park-like, unaware that these conditions were actively maintained by native communities using fire. 60 years after Cabrillo's expedition, Sebastián Vizcaíno mapped California from 1602 to 1603. The Spanish crown tasked Vizcaíno with exploring the California coast to locate safe harbors for the Manila galleon trade and to search for potential settlements. Vizcaíno set out with 3 ships, the San Diego, Santo Tomas, and Tres Reyes. He sailed northward from Acapulco and extensively explored the coastline. Vizcaíno reached and named San Diego Bay in November 1602, describing it as an excellent harbor, although it had been earlier noted by Juan Rodríguez Cabriio. One of Vizcaíno's most significant achievements was the detailed mapping of Monterey Bay in central California. He praised it as a perfect location for a port, although his descriptions were overly optimistic compared to the bay's actual conditions. Vizcaíno continued mapping the coast, documenting the Channel Islands and the region around modern Santa Barbara. Vizcaíno produced some of the most accurate and detailed maps of the California coast at the time, improving on Cabrillo's earlier records. On his mapping expedition, Vizcaino also reported widespread smoke near areas including present-day Los Angeles and San Diego. He described these fires as frequent and believed they might be part of indigenous practices or possibly natural wildfires caused by the dry climate. Indigenous peoples in California have rich oral traditions that emphasize the spiritual and practical significance of fire. For example, the Chumash tell stories of fire as a gift from the gods, used to create and sustain life. These stories often highlight the dual nature of fire as both a destructive and regenerative force, a concept deeply rooted in ecological observations. Tribes including the Miwok of Northern California tell myths about fire as a force of creation and destruction. In one story, fire was stolen from the gods and spread across the earth by a hawk. As the fire spread, it transformed the landscape, burning forests and grasslands, but also giving warmth and cooking capabilities to people. In Karuk mythology, fire was owned by selfish beings who hoarded it. In one legend, Coyote, a common trickster figure, devised a plan to steal fire and distribute it to humanity. After a daring chase, he successfully brought fire to the people, often burning his tail in the process. These myths often align with the Native American experience of wildfires as part of the natural cycle. Cabrillo's life exemplifies the complexities of the Spanish conquest. Today, Cabrillo is celebrated primarily for his role in charting the California coast. The Cabrillo National Monument in San Diego commemorates his achievements, casting him as a pioneering explorer who expanded Spain's knowledge of the Pacific. However, his involvement in the conquest of Guatemala serves as a reminder of the darker side of that legacy, a history marked by warfare, exploitation, and the disruption of indigenous cultures.